Glory Cloud Podcast, Episode 53. So stay tuned for more Kingdom Prologue discussion this week. Welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. I'm glad to be with you again as we continue marching through Kingdom Prologue.
Yes, we've got some exciting stuff to cover this morning. Okay, just the regular housekeeping before we get into that. We do have a show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. You can find the resources that we mentioned in the course of the episode. Please do, if you have not yet given us a rating on iTunes or subscribed, please do both of those things. And we'd really appreciate it if you'd tell some friends about the show. Also, we've had some requests on the Meredith Kline Facebook page, which I should plug more because that seems to be where we have most of our interaction with our listeners. I keep telling people that we have the email address, glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com, but we rarely hear from people that way. We mostly interact with our listeners at the Meredith Kline Facebook page. So if you're not a member there, you should go and join that so that we can interact with you there. But we've received some requests or some questions about how to get a hold of a copy of Kingdom Prologue. And if you'd like a soft copy, you should email the podcast at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com, and we can help you out there. Finally, if you have the means and you would like to contribute to the cost of monthly hosting of the podcast, the audio files, you can donate any amount that you would like at meredithkline.com/podcast. There is a donate button on the right-hand side of the page there. I think that's all I need to cover. Can you think of anything else, Lee?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. In that case, we're going to pick up where we left off last week, which was on page 20, and we didn't get to the two Adams scheme. So Kline uses that as another argument for there being a covenant right there in the beginning. Why don't you get us into that material?
Yeah, so it's just a very brief sentence here, or two sentences, but it's going to adumbrate some of the things that Kline will deal with later in the book. But basically he says, listing off all of these different arguments to support the idea that the arrangement between God and Adam or God and creation at the beginning before the fall was covenantal. He says here's another piece of evidence, and that is the two Adams scheme that we find later in Scripture, specifically in Paul in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. And so his argument is very simple. He says, if the role of Christ, quoting here on page 20, as the second Adam is recognized as covenantal, this scheme provides further clear warrant for classifying the arrangement made with the first Adam as covenantal. So I think that's a pretty simple and basic argument. Right. One neat thing here is that if you look at the older version of Kingdom Prologue, the 1991 version that we were talking about that was sort of a class syllabus handed out to students, and you compare that with the 2H Press version in 2000 or the Whiff and Stock version in 2006, there's a new paragraph here where he gives his preferred titles for these two covenants. So in traditional federal theology, there's the covenant of works, and then there's the covenant of redemption, which is the pre-temporal intra-Trinitarian covenant, sometimes called the Pactum Salutis. And Kline says, I like the term covenant of works. We need to keep that. We need to keep the word works in there. But the term covenant of redemption is a little bit unclear, and it kind of is a little bit confusing. It's not clear if that's the same as the covenant of grace or not. It's not, but it sounds similar enough. And so he comes up with a new scheme, and he must have come up with this sometime in the mid-90s. I remember him mentioning it in class in 1994 or something like that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and it wasn't in the 1991 edition of Kingdom Prologue. So sometime in the 90s, he came up with this and said, let's come up with two new labels. So the first covenant, the covenant with the first Adam, he's going to call the Creator's covenant of works with Adam. And then the second covenant, the covenant of redemption, he wants to call the Father's covenant of works with the Son, or with the second Adam.
Okay.
So creators versus fathers. Obviously, the creator and the father are the same, but pointing out a different role in that covenant. So the creator's covenant of works with the first Adam, and the father's covenant of works with the second Adam. But the nice thing about that structure of language is that calling the eternal intra-Trinitarian covenant the Father's covenant of works with the Son really highlights the parallelism of the two Adam scheme, so that you can see that they are both covenants of works, that both of these covenants are a covenants based on the principle of works. They both have a probationary element to them. They both involve a federal representative that affects those whom they represent. So when the first Adam breaks the Creator's covenant of works, his sin and guilt is imputed to the human race. When the second Adam passes the probation and fulfills the covenant of works, his righteousness is imputed to all those whom he represents, the new humanity, the elect.
Amen.
So I think that's a really neat structure that Kline came up with there in terms of the labels for those two covenants. And then, of course, you have the covenant of grace. Now, the covenant of grace, he would say, is distinct from both of those two covenants. He doesn't talk about it here. He'll get to it later in Kingdom Prologue. But the covenant of grace he views as the historical outworking and administration of the Father's covenant of works with the Son.
Yeah, we'll treat that covenant of grace obviously more as we go along, but this is the comparison between the first Adam and the last Adam is a tool that he's going to use here to argue for the presence of covenant at creation, and we're going to get into this much more richly as we go through Kingdom Prologue, but Kline is really compelled to make this move because he's seeing this comparison and contrast in passages like Romans 5, 1 Corinthians 15, and I even discovered, as I was using Kingdom Prologue for help on a sermon that I was writing from the book of Ephesians, that's something that he even sees going on in Ephesians chapter 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we always focus on Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 because there you have the explicit use of that language. Adam was a type of Christ, or the second Adam, that kind of stuff. But this two Adams scheme is not limited to those two passages. It's all over the place in Paul. I'm just sort of throwing out some passages that just leap into mind, but like the ones where he's talking about the image of God.
Right.
Not the Christological image of God, but the one where he's talking about the our sanctification being a renewal. Colossians 3, verse 10, we put on the new man, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. That and it's Ephesians 4:24 that uses similar language. But all the times when Paul talks about the new man is clearly Adamic language, but it's talking about the renewal of the image of God in the second Adam. And it's not just Paul. I mean, think about the Gospels. The Gospels are also full of this idea that Christ is, well, first of all, one of his main titles is that he is the Son of Man.
Right.
And Son of Man means, it goes back to Psalm 8, it goes back to Daniel 7. But obviously it means that he is a man. But in what sense? Well, it's in this second Adam sense, that he is the second Adam. And it focuses on his humanity, but it focuses on his humanity in his role as a second Adam figure. Mm-hmm. And all the passages in the Gospels about the obedience of Christ, how he resists the temptations of the devil.
Exactly.
He says, I come not to do my will, but the will of the one who sent me. So the two Adams scheme is very pervasive in the New Testament. And if we see all that as being covenantal, and I don't think you can really argue with that, then by implication, that shadow is cast back to the original arrangement, so that we have to see the original relationship between God and Adam is also covenantal.
Absolutely. So now we are on to page 22 and chapter 1, Lord of the Covenant Kingdom. And here he's going to look at ancient Near Eastern treaties a bit, right? Mm-hmm. Talks about how in those ancient Near Eastern treaties, the suzerain would set forth his claim upon the vassal's allegiance and authority, and that one of the ways that he would do that would be to list his names or ways that he was identified. And another way is that he would survey the things that he had done and the history of his dealings with his vassal. And so Kline sees parallels with both of those things in the early chapters of Genesis here.
Yeah, so just to quickly remind people that the ancient Near Eastern treaty format had the preamble identifying who the suzerain is. Then you give the historical prologue tracing the history of the relationship up to that point. Then you have the treaty stipulations, the law of the covenant, and usually that's subdivided into two parts: the general command of loyalty and then the specific detailed stipulations. Then you have the sanctions of the treaty, blessing and curse, and then you have the witnesses and the documentary clause. So Kline is basically using that structure here to provide his outline for this section of Kingdom Prologue. Not in detail, not a one-to-one correspondence, but basically chapter 1 is dealing with the preamble and the historical prologue together. Chapter 2 is also dealing with the historical prologue, especially the idea of the kingdom of God being endowed upon Adam in the garden. Chapter 3 is the law of the creation theocracy, so the stipulations. And then chapter 4 is titled Eschatological Sanctions. So that deals with the dual sanctions of blessing and curse. Chapter 4, by the way, is the one that we keep alluding to and saying, Kline's going to get into this in more detail about the covenant of works, and proving that it is a covenant of works with a probation and an eschatological hope of advancement and all of that. That's basically chapter 4. And then chapter 5 is what happened. Well, Adam broke the covenant. And so we have the temptation, the fall, and the judgment. So just sort of giving people a heads up of where we're going here in the next few chapters. But right now we're in chapter 1, titled Lord of the Kingdom Covenant. Of the Covenant Kingdom. Right. And he talks about how God uses the name Elohim in Genesis chapter 1 and the first few verses of chapter 2. Right. Then he uses a combination of Yahweh Elohim from Genesis 2:4 through 3:24. And then basically in chapter 4 and following, he uses either Elohim or Yahweh, depending on the purpose that he's using it for. Mm-hmm. And the reason that this is done this way is pretty clear. It's, quoting here from Kline on page 22, he says, clearly the remarkable combination of the name Yahweh with Elohim in the account of the pre-fall history in Genesis 2 and 3 is designed as a pointed declaration that Yahweh, the Lord of redemptive history, is Elohim, the creator God of Genesis 1. So, think about the audience of the Pentateuch and of the book of Genesis. Well, it's Israel at Mount Sinai, or maybe sometime after. It's the redeemed people of God who have received the revelation that God is Yahweh. Yahweh is his name, revealed at the burning bush, revealed in the preamble of the treaty document in the Ten Commandments. Now, Moses is going back in history to go all the way back to the beginning and talk about creation. And in talking about creation, he simply calls the creator Elohim. But then in chapter 2 and 3, he says Yahweh Elohim, in order to make the connection and say that the Elohim who's the creator in Genesis 1 is the same Yahweh that you are all familiar with, who has redeemed you out of Egypt and has made a covenant with you at Sinai.
Interesting, because that point at which he connects Yahweh and Elohim would be the very point where you're reading about the covenantal transaction between God and Adam and Eve.
Exactly. So that is another hint that there's going to be a connection here between the Sinai covenant and the covenant with Adam in the garden. So in this section here, Kline is just, remember, we're using the ancient Near Eastern treaty structures, so he's basically focusing on who is God, the idea of the preamble where the suzerain reveals his identity. So we're focusing on the names of God. He's Elohim, he's Yahweh, he's Elohim Yahweh, or Yahweh Elohim. But now he's going to move on in this major section here under chapter 1. He's got two major subdivisions. Section 1 is God, the Alpha author, and section 2 is God, the Omega consummator. So,
and they're hyphenated.
The Alpha and the Omega. Yeah, there's Kline's little hyphens again. He's the author and the consummator. He's the beginning and the end. He's the one that creates, and he's the one who consummates. So we're going to look now at God, the Alpha author, and under that section, he has 3 subsections: creator of all, A; sovereign architect builder, B; and glory spirit archetype, C.
Okay, so let's look at creator of all.
Yeah.
I really found the point that he's making here mind expanding, because for some reason, as I was growing up in the church, I just conceived of heaven as having always existed. That there was this realm and God lived there, and that was heaven. And if God was eternal, then, the place where he lived was eternal. But he identifies Christ with the God who created, and then very early on talks about Colossians 1:16, which, when I read that and thought about it, really does make the case that heaven itself, what Kline is going to talk about in this section as the invisible heaven, was something that God created in Genesis 1:1.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's go ahead and read some of these verses here. So we need to read Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then Genesis 2, verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And then you mentioned Colossians, and this is typical of Kline, right, where he's all over the Bible. He's not just saying, well, we can only look at Genesis and not bring in other passages. No, he goes right to the New Testament and allows it to inform our understanding of the Old. Colossians 1:16 says, for by him, that is Christ, the image of God. By him all things were created in heaven and on earth. So there's the heaven and earth that we just quoted from in Genesis 1. But then Paul adds an explanation there. He says, in heaven and on earth, comma, visible and invisible.
Exactly. And
so
go ahead.
That suggests that earth is referring to the visible creation and heaven is referring to the invisible creation. Right.
So God created not only the invisible heavenly realm, but also the inhabitants of that invisible realm as well, right?
Right. And where does he get that from, the inhabitants?
Well, even following that in the verse there, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him.
Right. And we know that those rulers and thrones and dominions are basically names of various angelic beings.
Right.
But Paul probably got that from Genesis 2:1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them.
Okay.
So the host of the earth, of course, would be all the creatures that live in the visible realm, but the host of heaven would be the angels.
Exactly.
And Kline points out an interesting parallel in Nehemiah that makes that clear. This is, when all the people are confessing their sin, and in this prayer, it says, Nehemiah 9, verse 6, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, comma, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. And you preserve all of them, and the host of heaven worships you." Wow. So notice how there you have the same, it's called a merism, where you have the totality of something being divided into its two parts. So heaven and earth. The whole creation is the whole, and then the two parts are the visible and the invisible realm. The invisible realm is called heaven, and then here in Nehemiah, it explicitly says that the hosts of heaven are worshiping you. So that suggests that it's the angels. So Colossians 1, Nehemiah 9 are both looking back on Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 2:1 and providing us with an authoritative intra-canonical exegesis so that we can understand that when it talks about heaven or the heavens in those two verses is referring to the invisible realm, which has to be distinguished from the word heaven as it's used within the 6 days.
Right. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 and following.
Right.
Okay.
Because 1:1 is giving you the absolute initial creation ex nihilo of all creation, both the visible and the invisible realm. Then verse 2 zeroes in on the visible realm and says, now the earth, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now let's focus on that second part. The earth was without form and void. And then the rest of the days of creation, let there be light and so on, are God fashioning that form and void, that formless and void earth into an orderly realm, dividing the waters above from the waters below and the land from the seas and so on, to be a habitable place for the physical creatures that God is going to make. But within that, in day 2, you have the creation of the other heaven that is called the sky. So verse 6, God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so, and God called the expanse heaven. So there's the same word heaven, Shemayim, that's used in 1:1, but now this heaven is, we could use superscripts here, right? We could say heaven 1 and heaven 2. Right. So heaven 1 is the invisible realm of God and the angels, but heaven 2 is the visible heaven that we call the sky, or you could call it maybe even the atmosphere, or whatever it is, it's the it's the earthly heavens that are actually a replica of the heavenly heavens.
Okay.
And that's why later on in the Bible, when we have descriptions of the heavenly heavens, we find all kinds of atmospheric language to describe it, like clouds, sun, stars, because since the earthly heavens, the visible heavens, are a lower register replica of the upper register heaven, we can use the lower register terminology to describe the upper register reality or archetype.
Okay. Are you thinking of like John's descriptions in the book of Revelation?
Yeah. I mean, it's all over. It's in Ezekiel, all the passages in the Bible that talk about heaven. Even in Revelation where it talks about that sea of glass, isn't that basically the firmament?
Right.
So it's not that there's a literal sea of glass in the invisible heaven, but since the invisible heaven where God dwells with his angels is invisible and we can't grasp it, we have to use lower register terminology to provide an analogy to help us to understand it. Okay.
So, sort of like prophetic idiom that we've talked about before.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
This is one of the things I love about Kline is that he's always speaking in terms of poetic images and how the Bible is just filled with all of these concrete poetic images that are drawn from our embodied physical experience of this creation, and then how God, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, uses all of those images poetically to describe spiritual truth and spiritual reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even God himself in this whole passage here in Genesis 1 is pictured in anthropomorphic terms as a workman who's going about his labors for 6 days, and then he rests on the seventh. You can't take that literally, right?
Right.
God doesn't actually need to rest, but it's anthropomorphism based upon the reality that we as human beings are made in the image of God. So if we are made in the image of God, then we can use humanity, we can use man as an analog to describe God.
Right. I mean, it really is helpful. It'd be like Moses explaining to them, okay, have you ever built something? Have you ever, built a house or something? Well, it was kind of like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Or have you ever gone for a hike up on a mountain? Well, that's kind of what it's going to be like when God meets with us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Kline, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, one thing we should point out is that Kline's interpretation of Genesis 1:1 is somewhat of a minority report these days. A lot of scholars interpret Genesis 1:1 as a summary of everything that's happening in days 1 through 6. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now let me show you what that looked like. And so that means that the heavens on day 2 are the same as the heavens in Genesis 1:1.
That's a good point. And so that would rob Genesis 1:1 of the invisible heaven aspect, correct?
And not only that, it would rob Genesis 1:1 from being a clear declaration of creation ex nihilo.
Okay.
So Kline wants to say, no, Genesis 1:1 is a declaration. It's an absolute declaration of the original act of the creation of the universe, of the whole created realm, out of nothing. And he even adds another Latin phrase. We usually just say ex nihilo, but he adds in nihilum to make it even more clear that God created everything out of nothing into nothing.
Exactly.
In nihilum. In other words, that makes clear that there's no prior created reality there.
And he's got a bit of an apologetic purpose in talking about this, correct?
Yeah.
I mean, Kline did his studies in the ancient Near East, so he would have been familiar with rival creation accounts.
Right.
And what he noticed about those, and what other scholars notice, is that there's pre-existing material. There are usually rival gods that are fighting, and it's the hero who wins, who builds the creation out of pre-existing stuff, including, the defeated god.
Right. Yeah. All of the ancient Near Eastern creation myths are, they don't explain where creation comes from in the beginning. They just assume that matter is there, and then there's some sort of battle between the gods and so on. But Genesis 1 is totally distinct from these other myths, even though it has certain similarities to these other myths. But yet there's a polemical thrust there, because only the biblical creation account has a clear affirmation of creation out of nothing and into nothing. And then that makes a very clear distinction between God and the created realm. The creator-creature distinction is absolute, whereas in the pagan myths, the gods are, in a sense, part of creation. They have physical attributes, and obviously there's more than one. There's many gods, and so on and so forth. And these things are all part of the ancient pagan mythology and pagan worldview and polytheism. Mm-hmm. And so the biblical account is just has no traces of that. No traces of any kind of struggle or conflict or anything. It's just God sovereignly speaking creation into existence out of nothing.
Right. You get the sense from reading the pagan myths that the gods were sort of like what we know today as superheroes.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I like that.
So, yeah. I mean, Marduk might be sort of like Superman. He's got very human qualities, but he's obviously able to do a lot more things than we're able to do.
He can do way more stuff than we can, right. But he's still physical and created in some way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great analogy. I like that. That's helpful.
But, I mean, God is saying through Moses that he's just a completely different category.
Yeah.
He's the God category, not the creation category.
Exactly. Yeah, Genesis 1:1 is so important. I mean, it's amazing, too, when you look at some of these other Old Testament scholars these days. I mean, even respected evangelicals like John Walton, for example. He doesn't think that Genesis 1:1 teaches creation out of nothing. He says, I affirm that doctrine as a doctrine. And then he'll say, well, maybe it's taught somewhere in the New Testament. Maybe Colossians 1:16 teaches it. But Genesis 1:1 doesn't teach it. He just thinks it's a summary of the rest of the account. And so it's giving the summary statement, and then days 1 through 6 is giving the details. But that means that it doesn't explain the original creation of the entire created universe, including the invisible heavens. So it just really leaves the doctrine of creation ex nihilo hanging in the air. Where does that doctrine come from? Did Paul invent it? Or, well, maybe not Paul. Maybe it existed sometime in the late, Second Temple Jewish literature. You can find statements to that effect in Josephus and Philo. But it just really robs that doctrine of power and strength if you don't have Genesis 1:1 standing behind it. To me, Genesis 1:1 is, in some ways you could say it's the most important verse in the Bible. It's the very beginning. It's the absolute declaration. It's the creator-creature distinction. God is God and not the creator or the creature, and the creature is not the creator. You can't get anything more basic than that.
Right. Now, Kline appeals to Proverbs 8 for his understanding of Genesis 1:1 as being distinct and not a summary statement. Should we spend some time on Proverbs 8?
Sure, yeah, we could mention that. This is another passage like Nehemiah 9 and Colossians 1 that help to shed light on Genesis 1. We'll go ahead and read some of it there. Proverbs 8, verse 22. The Lord possessed me referring to wisdom. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work. And Kline makes a big deal out of that word beginning because it's the same word Reshit used in Genesis 1:1. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old, ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, and so on. So Kline is saying, look, this is clearly a meditation on Genesis 1:1. And I think his main point here is that use of the word beginning, so that he sees the beginning here as the absolute beginning. It's not just some sort of, some people have said that Genesis 1:1 could be translated as, like that phrase, on the day when or something, or in the beginning, at the beginning of the creation. But it's not the absolute beginning, the initial alpha point before anything existed.
Right. But
Proverbs 8:22 seems to make it that way, seems to take the beginning as that initial point. And that before Genesis 1:1, before in the beginning, there literally is nothing but God.
Right. There's the Lord. You get the sense that there is a distinction between the Lord and wisdom, but the Lord and wisdom are together before anything called creation.
Right.
So.
And then, of course, this is important in Christology because wisdom here is, it's Christ. It's the second person of the Trinity.
Right.
As we know from the New Testament, from passages like John 1, verses 1-3, Colossians 1, 15-17, and also when Paul says that Christ is the wisdom of God in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 24. So there's also a Christological element here. And Kline has this great quote I like. He says, according to Proverbs 8, the divine wisdom was present at the earliest creation of God. And God, the one to whom wisdom relates before the primeval beginning, is simply there, unquestioned, presupposed, the eternal, the Lord, and there is none else.
That's a great quote.
Because, you read the rest of that Proverbs 8 passage, and wisdom then says, look, I was there before anything. I was there before the physical creation began. And then he says, I was beside him like a master workman. I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always. And so that's a pretty strong, if you look at Proverbs 8 in light of the New Testament, in light of all those passages we just mentioned, 1 Corinthians 1, Colossians, John, and so on, it's pretty clear that this places Christ on the creator side of the creator-creature distinction.
Absolutely.
He's not one of the creatures. He was there before all the creatures came forth.
Before Abraham was.
Yeah.
So should we move on to section B, the sovereign architect builder, or should we say more about Genesis 1:1 and Proverbs 8 and all of that?
No, I think we should move to the next section.
Okay. So here we're going to look at the architectural imagery that Moses uses for God, and that the rest of the Bible uses for God as well.
Uses for God in his work of creation.
Yes.
Well, it's like what you just said a minute ago, right? Talking to the Israelites. Have you ever built a house? Well, it's kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Kline appeals to Isaiah 45, verse 18. For thus says the Lord who created the heavens, he is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it empty. He formed it to be inhabited. So that's the idea, is that God created the heavens and the earth in order to be inhabited. In other words, this marvelous picture of God creating the visible and invisible world is an analogy. It's a picture of God creating the world to be a place for man to dwell in the physical, in the visible realm, but also for God. It's also God's dwelling place in the invisible realm.
Right.
So it's a dwelling. It's like it's an architectural analogy. God is building a house.
It's interesting because there's some teleology involved here too, right? I mean, there's a goal beyond these dwelling places. Mm-hmm. You can hear in the Isaiah 45:18 that God is going to create man, and these dwelling places, both the visible and the invisible, are being set up for God to dwell with man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, it's all hinted at there in verse 2. Now the earth was without form and void. The second word, void, means empty. In other words, there weren't any inhabitants yet. Mm-hmm. So God's got to deal with those two issues. Without form means it's not structured. It's just an unformed chaos, if you will. But it's also void, so he's got to deal with both of those. So in the days of creation, then he begins to bring structure to the visible creation to make it full of form so that it is a structure. And then he's got to put creatures in it so that it's not void, so that it's not empty. And the creatures, of course, are all of the birds and the animals, but also man himself.
Right.
And Kline has an interesting analogy here. You know, when he's describing this architectural imagery, he says, look, I mean, it talks about the creation of the expanse or the firmament. That's kind of like, the overhead covering or shelter for man. Mm-hmm. And it also talks about God placing the lights, the luminaries, in the sky. Well, that's kind of like hanging lamps from the ceiling, right? That's creating the lamps to illuminate the dwelling place for man to dwell in.
So again, I mean, it's like an analogy to a house.
Mm-hmm. You know, it even says in verse 15, let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. So there seems to be a reference to man. They're going to be for signs and for seasons, verse 14. They're not just, when we think in modern astronomy, we just think of all these stars and galaxies out there emitting light. But, in a way, we got to view this in a more earth-centered way, that it's all there for man. It's all there to provide light on the earth and to provide season markers for signs and for seasons. God created the world for us to live in.
Right. There again, that implied goal. We're building here in Genesis to the creation of Adam and Eve.
Yep. And so the sixth day of creation is going to be the climax when God says, let us make man in our own image. But there's all these hints along the way, right? Preparing for that.
Right.
For that climax. Even as far back as verse 2, that the earth was formless and void.
Void, right.
And Kline also brings up some interesting passages in the poetic parts of Scripture, in Job and Proverbs and the Psalms, to support his architectural understanding. For example, Job 38, verse 4, this is when the Lord comes and speaks to Job out of the whirlwind and basically says, who are you? Were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determines its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? Yeah,
sounds like what we would call a construction worker, or over in the UK, a builder.
Mm-hmm.
Measuring.
It even mentions bars and doors in verse 10. So it's definitely an architectural image here. And of course, you have the wise master builder of Proverbs 8. And then the more you think about it, you realize that this isn't just for man, it's also for God. Isaiah 66, verse 1, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Or Psalm 11, verse 4, Yahweh is in his holy temple. His throne is in the heavens. So this cosmos, with both parts of it, both the visible and the invisible, is not only a dwelling place for man, it's also a dwelling place for God. It's God's holy temple.
And he fills it all. I mean, both the invisible and the visible.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting how when we, in theology, we talk about the attribute of omnipresence. But interestingly, in the Bible doesn't use quite that language, although I guess you could say Psalm 139 comes close when it talks about wherever I go, God is there. Even if I go into heaven or even if I go into the depths of the earth, God is there. But most of the time, the Bible uses this language of God filling, like you said, God filling the entire world, the entire universe. And that's a little bit of a different way of putting it. It does say the same thing, omnipresence, but by using that word fill, doesn't that bring out kind of a connotation of the glory cloud filling the tabernacle and the temple?
Mm-hmm.
So it has more of a cultic connotation to it, right?
Right.
And it brings out this idea that the cosmos is God's holy temple. It's just a different way of thinking about it, you know?
Right. And it's rich. I love the richness of all of this.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to what we were saying about the use of metaphor, analogy, and drawing upon our embodied experience of physical reality to describe these spiritual realities that we can't see God, and yet we can sort of begin to grasp this idea if we think of, you know, God is invisible and yet he fills his holy temple. It's a wonderful thing. It's a richer way of thinking about God than just thinking in purely abstract, you know, attributes of God, invisible, spiritual, omnipresent. Now we're thinking more in invisible and physical terms, even though God's not visible and physical, but we're using those visible and physical created ways of thinking as stepping stones towards God's spiritual reality.
Exactly. You know, we've got the idiom, I guess, to put flesh on something. Mm-hmm. You know, I was going to say, if we said that what we were doing is putting flesh on those abstract terms that you just listed off, it really is talking about, I love the way you put it, making an analogy to our embodied existence. Mm-hmm.
And it all makes sense because God set it up that way.
Yep.
He created the universe and man himself to be a replica of himself. And so it's not surprising that we can take those, and that God himself in Scripture poetically takes those physical things and uses them as pointers to the heavenly reality.
So from there, Kline turns to the Canaanite Baal epic.
Right.
And as with other pagan myths, you've got pre-existing matter and you've got warring gods. Correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so in the Baal epic, the Canaanite epic that was discovered at Ugarit, and they read the tablets and they saw that there's this whole story of Baal. He's the Canaanite storm god, and of course that was the main god that the Israelites were so tempted throughout their history to commit idolatry with, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, over and over again, it's like Baal worship is the big sin. I mean, there were other Canaanite gods that they struggled with, but Baal worship seems to be the biggest one in the time of Elijah and so on. And so it's kind of interesting then with that background to say Genesis 1 is looking at the same mythological realities as the Baal epic is, namely, where did this universe come from? But it's describing it in a way that is very polemical, because God is not adapting the creation account to the pagan mythology, but demythologizing it and polemically undercutting it and showing how all of these ideas that are found in the Canaanite Baal epic are totally false. There's no battle with chaos. Chaos is mentioned, right? Tohu vabohu in verse 2, but there's no battle with it. It's not like chaos is a dragon that has to be killed. And there's no theomachy. Theomachy is just when the gods are fighting each other, like you were saying, and superheroes fighting each other or something. It's not that. It's just God sovereignly creating all things out of nothing and then organizing his glorious cosmic palace. There's no trace of any struggle. And so it's very clear that the way Kline puts it is the creation fiats are not battle cries, but architectural directives.
Right. He also talks about how it's not as though God, like these other pagan myths, has a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other.
Yeah.
First of all, there's no need for a sword because he's unique and sovereign and there's no one to oppose him. But, even in a sense, he doesn't need the trowel because he's not working with pre-existing stuff. He's speaking creation into existence. I suppose there's an aspect of the trowel being appropriate in the architect, the builder analogy that's being made, but the analogy is about where it would end. But you use the word demythologize, and maybe some of our listeners aren't familiar with what that means. Would you unpack that for a moment? Because Kline says that we're not demythologizing the Bible, but the Bible is demythologizing some of these pagan myths. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, to demythologize is simply a way of saying that you are critiquing the myth and showing it up for what it is, that it's just a myth, and exposing it. Well, if you want to bring it into the terms of like New Testament scholarship, where Bultmann tried to demythologize the New Testament, that means translating the New Testament into existential philosophy and taking out all of the things in it that we don't believe in anymore, like demons and angels and apocalyptic Son of Man coming in glory and so on. All that stuff has to be demythologized according to Bultmann. Kline's not using that concept. He's not saying we have to demythologize Genesis 1. He's saying Genesis 1 is demythologizing the Canaanite myth and showing that it's a myth and exposing it.
Right. Okay.
But there is something interesting here we need to bring out, which is Genesis 1 is clearly, not at all adopting pagan mythology. Mm-mm. It's just the opposite. There's no theomachy. There's no conquering of the chaos dragon like Baal does. There's no struggle. But later on in the Bible, in Job and the Psalms and so on, there are some passages that do make use of the idea of the battle with chaos in reference to this mythological creature called Rahab. So Kline has to deal with that. So he's dealing now with these other passages, not with Genesis 1, and he's asking what's going on in these other verses. So, for example, in Job 26, in verses 10 and following, it's looking back on creation. He has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he shattered Rahab. And then again in Psalm 89 verse 10, you crushed Rahab like a carcass. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. And there are a few other passages too. What do we make of these? So Kline argues that here in these later passages, the Bible does make literary use of the Canaanite mythology of Baal conquering the chaos dragon, but without endorsing that pagan mythology. So these passages are not adopting or endorsing that mythology and saying that it really is true. Rather, he's saying that these later passages are simply using the terminology of the Canaanite Baal epic purely as a matter of poetic figure of speech, just as a way of, in poetry, you see this even in Renaissance literature. Christian authors will talk about Christian things, but then they will use, pagan Greek and Roman mythology as a way of poetically describing something in a Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like that. So the Bible is not endorsing this mythology. It's not saying that Rahab literally existed, but rather it's saying, here's another way of describing what Genesis 1 is talking about.
Okay.
Not as a literal theomachy, not as a literal chaos Kampf. That's the German word for struggle with the chaos monster. Not literally that, but simply as a poetic adaptation of the Canaanite Baal epic in order to affirm the sovereignty of God. So Kline has a section where he deals with that, and he basically says that what we should think of the pagan myths as a garbled version of the truth.
Exactly. I remember him saying something like that in class too, because at first it may seem like, it may seem startling or alarming that these other ancient traditions had similar stories, but you shouldn't be concerned about that. I mean, it makes sense that they lived in exactly the same world mm-hmm. that God's people lived in, and they experienced the same, for example, the flood, mm-hmm. but they're going to take, in their unbelief, a different way of accounting for that and explaining it. Yeah, that's right. Because the Epic of Gilgamesh has a lot of parallels with the flood narrative in Genesis 6 through 9. And of course, unbelieving critics have said, "See, the Bible is just borrowing from these pagan myths." But it's actually the way around. It's that the Bible's account is the correct one. It's the one that was handed down through the godly line, through Seth and his descendants, all the way down to Noah, down to Abraham, down to the time of Moses. And so that's the godly line preserving the true oral tradition of what happened. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Canaanite Baal epic, or whatever you want to talk about in the surrounding world, is a garbled, apostate version of that story, mixed in with, all their views about the false gods and the idols and their understanding, which basically denies the creator-creature distinction and makes the gods part of creation. So it's the other way around. It's not that the Bible is borrowing from them, it's that they're borrowing from the truth, and that they have confused it and mixed it up with their false understanding of God. Mm-hmm. So you get elements of truth in there.
Right.
But I like that term, garbled.
Yeah. And then you have these passages in Job and the Psalms where the covenant community that worships Yahweh as the only true God can then use certain terms and words taken from their ancient Near Eastern context, like the term Rahab, even though that's the garbled myth, mm-hmm. but they can take that term and then sort of redeem it and use it in a demythologized way as a purely poetic literary device to describe the truth without affirming the actual existence of Rahab.
Right. I like what Kline says on page 29, that speaking of in Genesis 1 and the fiats that God issued, the creation fiats are not battle cries, but architectural directives.
Yeah, that's helpful.
So, like his trowel and sword analogy. But
yeah, I mean that's the main problem with the pagan mythology, is that they ascribe, because they don't believe in the creator-creature distinction, they ascribe too much power to the creation, as if the creator, Baal, has to do battle with some elements of creation, as if the creation is somehow this monster that he has to conquer. Whereas the biblical view is that God is the creator. The creation is just totally subordinate to God and under his absolute control and sovereignty. And so he doesn't have any struggle. He just simply speaks and it comes into existence. There is no struggle. There's no equality there, because God is absolutely above creation and prior to creation.
Which, I mean, would have been so radical in the ancient world that Moses first wrote this in.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, God was never in any danger in his work of creation. Didn't actually break a single drop of sweat. Yeah. How radical would that have been in a world of pagan myths?
And then he quotes here from Isaiah 44, verse 24. Thus says Yahweh, I, Yahweh, am the maker of all things, who stretched out the heavens, I alone, and spread out the earth. Who was with me? So there was no one with him. Wasn't another God helping him. There wasn't some sort of chaos monster that he had to fight with. God is alone in the beginning, and he is the sole maker of all things.
Amen.
And then once again, if you bring in Proverbs 8 about wisdom being there at the beginning, that's a pretty powerful juxtaposition, right? Isaiah 44:24 with Proverbs 8.
Exactly. Because, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah. Who was with me? No one. But wasn't wisdom there? Well, yeah, but that's because wisdom is the maker.
Exactly.
So another powerful proof text for the deity of Christ.
Right. A distinction of person, but not of being.
Right.
So much richness. But I think that unless you have any more you'd like to say about how Genesis 1 and 2 actually demythologize pagan myths, I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lee. I really enjoyed that discussion.
I enjoyed it too.
All right. So thank you to all of our listeners. I hope that you will get yourself a copy of Kingdom Prologue and read ahead to about page 40 for next week, and we will see you then.